is God a moral monster? Dawkins has this wonderful phrase in The God Delusion. Well, a whole sentence, paragraph is almost Pauline in its length. He says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving, a control freak, vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, thank you, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. I think he may have put up a straw man for me, or a straw god. It's so exaggerated, you might just simply dismiss it, but let's take it seriously. That in the Old Testament, we have a problem with a picture of God which we don't always like. God gave Israel two great gifts, the law and the land. Unfortunately, the land was occupied and the law looks barbaric to us. But that's the problem. It all depends on how it looks to us. It looks barbaric to us. We have to think back to the practical problems there and then. For all aspects of ethics, it's worth asking, what would Jesus do? A great new modern phrase which answers so many questions. What would Jesus do? Because in him we see what God is like, what it would be like if God was human, what it is like when God is human. We see him motivated by compassion and by justice. He shows love and he shows anger. He did miracles of healing because of a gut-wrenching compassion. They had to invent a new word for that, splanknazome, just for Jesus, because of that gut-wrenching feeling he had for people. And we see him angry as well. He verbally attacks the Pharisees and all hypocrites. And when he's driving people out of the temple, he makes himself a whip to do it more effectively, and drives the financial crooks out of the marketplace in the temple. And we have to ask ourselves, if Jesus was there in the Old Testament, telling people exactly what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? Because often, on many issues, the Bible is silent. It doesn't tell us about evils like heroin, or cybercrime, or daytime TV. At different times, we have different problems to deal with, and different solutions. Different times produce different possible solutions, different possible methods for stopping evil. Who'd ever have thought that we could stop dictators from harming their own population, like we're trying to do now? Things move. But we have to put ourselves back into the ancient Near Eastern times. At that time, the easiest way to get rich is to kill your neighbours, steal all they have, and take it home with you. There's no facilities for prisoners of war. What on earth do you do with all those prisoners? There aren't any prisons that could hold them. You can dig through a stone wall when there isn't mortar and you've got enough time and a teaspoon. You can dig your way out through a mud wall very, very quickly. There's just no prisons to keep people in. And family revenge was the motivating factor, the motivating morality of the time. So if someone killed one of your family, you're honor bound to kill them back. If you're a child, you grow up and then you kill them. Now, the Sunday school version of the conquest of Canaan goes like this. The Israelites all escaped Egypt one day in spring, and they went to Canaan. They spent 40 years in the desert because the older generation was scared. Then the new generation defeated Jericho, swept through Canaan, killing everyone. They were following their law, which told them to kill men, women, and children, and they even had to kill animals, and they had to devote, i.e. destroy, everything of value. The reality is different. Not just the reality of archaeology is different, the reality in the Bible is different. The reality in the Bible text does not say that. They destroyed Jericho and killed everyone living there. Jericho was a military post guarding the land. They destroyed Ai and Hazor, but not many others according to Joshua, according to the book of Joshua, and according to archaeology. They destroyed the major cities which stood up to them. Now, a city was a military place. It's a place where the leader lives, it's where the administration lived, it's not where the people lived. They were told to kill everyone, but they were also told not to marry them. Let me read some of Deuteronomy here. When the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them, show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. For they would turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. How do we square that circle? How do they kill everyone and then marry them? Well, the answer is in verse 2. When the Lord gives them over to you to defeat them, those who attacked were killed. Those who didn't continued living among them. Now, who attacks them? In the Sunday school version, everyone attacks them. But according to the Bible and according to archaeology, a handful of cities actually stood out against them. And not many people lived in those cities. Most of the people were farmers. They lived around the land that they farmed. Now, of course, when an enemy attacked, lots of people moved into the city. Farmers suddenly became soldiers, and perhaps the rest of their family did as well. Or, if they're more sensible, instead of running to the city, they ran off into the bushes and waited till the fighting had finished, and then they came back to their farms. Now, if you attacked a city and defeated it, what do you do next? A normal army rapes, pillages, and kills. It still happens nowadays. Israel wasn't allowed to rape or pillage. They could rescue and marry girls that they found attractive, but they were not allowed to sleep with them for a whole month. That takes away the whole rape thing. And then they married them. And Israel wasn't allowed to pillage. That law that says they have to destroy everything means they can't keep it. Livestock and clothing were burned, indestructible metals were given to the temple. Most people in the ancient Near East went to war in order to get rich. And Israel couldn't do that. There's no soldier in Israel who got rich, except Achan, who died. The law of Moses did not leave that motive for warfare. Warfare was only ever for self-defense. Because why else go to the trouble if you can't keep anything? Now, some cities called in their farmers and they created an army to attack Israel. And when that happened, the law of Moses said they had to be brutal. When they won, they had to kill everyone. But they had no choice. When a modern war ends, you destroy the armory of the opposite side. Like when the Americans bombed Saddam Hussein as the army was retreating back from Kuwait. They had to destroy all those tanks, because otherwise next spring those same tanks would come back again. They had to they had to destroy the armory. Ancient arsenals of war weren't tanks and planes, they were people. People. And if they didn't kill those soldiers, next spring they would be honor-bound to come back for revenge. Now, modern armies always set out with a set of rules of engagement. For peacekeeping, they may shoot only if they're shot at. Oh, that's the bravest sort of soldier I know, who can walk down the street knowing that someone might shoot at them, and they're not allowed to do anything until they actually hear the shots. And in some warfare, they have to avoid civilian casualties at almost all costs. And in others, civilians are legitimate targets because they harbour the enemy. Different rules of engagement for different situations. Joshua read out the rules of engagement before the people at Jericho. And he was applying the general rules that you find in Deuteronomy 20. If you compare what he says in Joshua 6 and Deuteronomy 20, you see it's roughly the same. And those rules are, if they attack an enemy town within Palestine, they've got to destroy it utterly. They kill every person and animal, they burn everything flammable. The indestructible gold, silver and bronze is donated to the temple. That's what's called the ban, or the devotion, herem. Now, I think any modern reader is horrified by that sort of rules of engagement. If not, then you've seen too many bloodthirsty movies at an early age. In modern warfare, we avoid civilian casualties. We have smart bombs, we have clever soldiers, we have armory. Soldiers who surrender are captured, they're not executed. There's been some very serious exceptions to that, of course. Actually, the rules of engagement that we find in Deuteronomy, there's two sets. There's one set for those in Palestine, for cities that stand against them in Palestine. There's a completely different set for cities outside. Outside Palestine, you don't have this utter destruction and death. That's only for cities within Palestine. Outside, they're treated much more kindly. Not because they like the people around them, but because they're not such a danger. Anyone who surrenders from a city outside Palestine is not to be killed. If a soldier has been fighting against them and they surrender, then they become your servants. You make sure they don't become soldiers again by making them your servants, but you don't kill them. And they fight only the males who... Sorry. And if they fight, the males are only put to death when they're defeated. It sounds rough by modern standards, of course, but it's remarkably lenient. You don't kill people who don't attack you. You don't kill the male population only if they're fighting for you, fighting against you. They even have merciful rules of engagement for the trees of the enemies. They needed wood for fuel and for making siege engines, but they weren't allowed to use the fruit trees. They weren't allowed to cut those down unnecessarily. And the reason is the trees are not humans. They're not dangerous. You are kind to them. The point is, they're doing as little violence as necessary. They only killed men who were actually soldiers and who actually attacked them. If they surrender, they let them live, but keep an eye on them as servants. But within Palestine, the situation is very different. There, you have an enemy inside the camp, so to speak. And you can't put up a wall like modern Israel does. You can't have 24-hour guards around them all the time. And you can't even leave their children, because they are honor bound to grow up and kill you. Now, other nations at the time weren't lenient like that. Other nations normally just killed every male of a town that's surrendered or was defeated, or at least maim them. Here you, on next one, no, they at least maim them. In 1 Samuel 11, it says the Ammonites are told, a city tries to surrender to the Ammonites, and they're told, we accept, but we're going to gouge out the right eye of every male. Israel was known to be different. In 1 King 20, the advisors of King Aram are told, let's surrender, because the kings of Israel are merciful. They were known to have a different set of laws to the others around them. The total destruction of livestock and property was unique in the Old Testament world, because looting enemy goods was what gave you a motive for being a soldier. Julius Caesar was the first person to actually pay his soldiers. Before that, his soldiers were paid by how much they could steal from the people they were attacking. So their only motive is self-defense. Of course, the law of Moses was completely uncompromising about religion. The Israelites went out of their way to go and destroy the high places. These worship centres were on top of hills and just had a wooden pole or a stone altar, but they had to destroy the whole nation and wipe out whole peoples. Why couldn't they do that by just destroying the religion? It does sound like cultural genocide. We can feel morally offended about that because it sounds like racism. But actually we find in the text that Israel wasn't racist. Israel allowed marriage of foreigners. We have Ruth and we have Rahab becoming part of the line that produces the Messiah. We have Moses marrying a Midianite, Moses marrying a Cushite. There was no problem with marrying foreigners, but only the foreigners who actually lived in the land who were going to corrupt you. And we find out more when we find out more about those actual religions. They weren't all equally bad. To be honest, we don't know too much about them, but what we know is horrific enough. Molech worship was the really bad one. Molech was a god which received babies. You heat up the Molech statue to roasting point, and then you give it the baby. And if you give your firstborn to Molech, then you're guaranteed to have other children. Whew. Baby sacrifices were offered in this horrendous way in a place called a Tophet. They're almost completely scarred out of the land in Palestine. They got rid of these places so absolutely, stamped them out, that we have almost no evidence left in Palestine. But go on a tourist holiday to Tunisia. Go to the museum in Sousse, and then there you'll find a whole room full of these little tombstones for these babies who've been offered to the gods in a Tophet. I remember my utter shock and distress when I just wandered into this dull-looking room and suddenly realised what it was, the remains of this well-preserved Tophet. You have some pictures on the tombs of a priest holding out his arms and the baby being put into the priest's arms. Ugh. And buried under those stones, they found the child's bones, or the burnt remains of those child bones. And modern Tunisian archaeologists sometimes say, oh, these were just children's graveyards. They were not just a nice place, but you don't place your child in a foreign graveyard somewhere else. You put them next to your grandmother or in the family grave. But these are just children. Just children. They've been offered to the gods. In our modern world, we have a commendable attitude of religious tolerance, but some things we can't tolerate. The Spanish invaders stamped out human sacrifice among the Mayans, and I'm glad they did. The Baptist missionary William Carey successfully campaigned against sati, the killing, the Hindu practice of killing a wife when the husband dies. And I'm glad they stamped out that practice, though you have rumours it's still happening. Joshua's army started ridding the world of human sacrifice. Fortunately, that sort of worship is almost completely gone now. Was Israel also asked to commit cultural genocide? Cultural genocide, yes. Racial genocide, no. They didn't kill everyone. They weren't asked to. They didn't do it. They killed soldiers who attacked them and the families of those soldiers if they were living amongst them. If they were outside, soldiers who didn't attack were spared, families, of course, were spared. Their laws forbade rape and pillage, and they only went to war in self-defense. Is that a monstrous law? Oh, if only the nations of the world followed at least that law, we'd be in a much better state. But of course, now we have prisons for putting prisoners of war, and we can be much better than that. They followed a law which was necessary in their time and as lenient and as accepting as was possible at that time. I'm going to stop there for questions and have a second half on the law in the Old Testament in general. But questions now on genocide. And can I also point out that I already said about this book. It's at the back, $3.95, and go and pick that up at the end. But questions on genocide at the moment, and then the rest of the Old Testament law will be done very quickly. Yeah, so.
Hi, yes. What do you think, how do you explain in the best way those parts in Deuteronomy where essentially Yahweh seems to be saying, or is saying, okay, so kill the women who have been married, who have lain with a man, but the virgins you keep for yourself?
Yeah, it is very difficult. Can you pass along there for the next question? We have laws where the virgins are allowed to be kept, but married women can't be kept. I would say that when you married someone, then you're honour bound to revenge that person's death. But also the daughter you would expect to be honour bound, and the hope is obviously that the daughter will be married to someone and will become emotionally attached to that person and won't be a danger to the community in that way. Other nations would have said, well, just kill everyone, or rape the women and then kill them. But that isn't what happened in Israel. And I would say that that was lenient. But of course, we look at it and we think it's barbaric. And in our terms, it is barbaric because we can keep prisoners of war, we can keep populations at bay, and we have more choices now. But yeah, I'd say that we shouldn't be saying, why did they kill the wives? But why on earth didn't they kill those children? And they were hoping to convert them, hoping to turn them.
Marriage also a form of rape?
Oh yes, and if there was any forced marriage, that certainly would be a form of rape. And the marriage can't be forced. In a marriage, you have two people making vows. If you don't have the vows, it's a concubine, it's not a wife.
Yeah, I find the problem with the text, and a lot of my atheist friends bring this up, the fact that in Exodus, when God gives Moses the 10 Commandments, he says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not take your neighbor's goods or whatever, and yet God is actually commanding the Jews to do exactly what he told them not to. So naturally, non-believers will say, well, God is a God of contradiction, or the Bible is a book of contradiction.
Yeah, you've got nice simple rules in the 10 Commandments. When it says you shall not kill, That doesn't mean you shall not kill a murderer. It doesn't mean you shall not kill in battle. It says you shall not murder. You should not murder. And if someone does murder, then in the Old Testament, of course, there's capital punishment. You have to kill the murderer. It's a nice, simple set of rules, which are obviously, which can be interpreted in obvious ways. But if you start saying it says do not kill, therefore you must not kill anything, you're just
taking someone else's land.
Yeah. If they're attacking you, you have to defend yourself. And the Israelites were coming in and living among the Palestinians, and sometimes those Palestinians then said, right, we're going to attack, we're going to get rid of these newcomers. It wasn't a land that was crowded like nowadays. It's not a land that was completely farmed like it is nowadays. It wasn't like England, where every parcel of land has a fence around it. It was a land which didn't have many people in it. So when Israel went into it, they weren't pushing anyone out, but when people fought them, they defended themselves.
You mentioned Achan. I don't understand why Achan's children, household servants and their children also had to be killed for his sin. It seems so unfair. And the other one as well is the Lot offering his daughters as if that was, okay.
Yeah. It's a very different world, and we just can't understand why that sort of thing would be considered just. And I can't get myself into their mentality, into their heads enough to be able to say, oh yeah, I can see that, that's easy. I can see logically that the whole of Achan's family would have been behind this. You don't keep secrets in your family, and if you let the rest of the family get away with it, it's not really the same. But it still feels wrong to me with modern law, which is so surgical, so it zooms in with evidence for a particular person. We don't think like that anymore, and I agree, it's great in my mind too. But I can't get myself into their mind sufficiently to say I condemn them for the way in which they did that.
Hi.
Where?
Sorry, over here. Thinking about things like the destruction of the Canaanites, for example, with the mass, you might not want to call it genocide, I don't know, but with those mass killings, why do you think God would actually order soldiers to go in and do all the killing in the first place if he needed them wiped out? Why not do something like, well, I don't know, give them all a simultaneous heart attack or something, It might be a bit of a simplistic question, but it is one that you have to wonder about. If God really thinks it's necessary for a huge number of people to be wiped out, why does he have to give it instructions to people to go and physically do it with their blades?
Well, first of all, you're putting up a straw man saying everyone was wiped out, and that wasn't so. It wasn't ordered, it didn't happen. But you're saying, why did God need to use people as soldiers in the first place? Or can you hand the microphone on so it goes to the next person? Why do you need to have soldiers in the first place? Why do they need to attack anyone? Why couldn't God just strike them all down? Yeah, well, occasionally God does do that sort of thing. He kills people with hailstones when Joshua was attacking people on his long day. He killed people with plagues. But usually God uses us. And that is a very profound mystery. Why does God want us to pray for people? Why does God want us to help people when God could step down and send an angel to go and do the same thing? Why does God use us? That's the big mystery, and that's because he's a big God who loves us and actually loves humans. We're part of his process. We're part of his work. And we'd love to just sit in an armchair and do nothing all day, but actually God wants us to get out there.
What I'm kind of slightly struggling with here in this context is, what does this really say about the nature of God? Because if you compare this to our Lord Jesus in the New Testament, I know that you try and reconcile the two by the time you finish today. But I'm just wondering, back then in that context, what does it really say, in your opinion, about the nature of God?
We have the same God who's got the same aims in different parts of the time and different ways in which he can make that aim work. We have God wanting to get rid of that terrible sort of religion where children are being sacrificed. And how does he do that? But you don't have that sort of situation in the New Testament. We have a situation where God needs to get rid of people who are attacking Israel. How do you do that? Do you put them in prison? There aren't any prisons. You can't build any prisons to keep them in. You have to kill them. You've got different situations, different ways of doing things. And Christians have a great advantage of not being rulers of nations and not needing to enforce rules, not needing to be criminal judges and executioners. And the law of the New Testament doesn't tell us anything about that sort of process. So you're going to get very different sort of documents in the New Testament and the Old Testament, because we got documents for ruling a nation in the Old Testament, we got documents for spreading morality in the New Testament. So we've got the same God doing what he's trying to do in the Old Testament, doing what he's trying to do in the New Testament, and with different situation and different methods, but only by the limitations of how the world is changing.
Just one thing. I know you're going to talk about the law later and you want to refer to genocide, but somebody's already brought up Lot, so I'll just have a related question. And the whole business of Lot and him sleeping with his daughters whilst drunk, and the whole business of Abraham being urged to commit adultery with the maidservant, and then the business of God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, I find it difficult to reconcile them. And I know you said you can't get into the minds of those people, but God approves, doesn't he?
Yeah, we've got a whole host of issues there. Right, we've got Lot, and we've got Abraham, we've got Sodom and Gomorrah, and you're going to bring up a whole load more. It's an awful lot to cover. But let me just say, first of all, Lot was not supposed to sleep with his daughters. Abraham wasn't committing adultery with Hagar. It was a normal part of ancient Near Eastern law, particularly in that you can have a concubine, that is, it's a wife which doesn't have the same vows. She has the rights to the same rights for feeding and living with the husband, but she doesn't actually own the children that she produces. It's the law of the time. And Abraham seems to have gone beyond the law and treated Hagar like a real wife, and that caused great problems with Sarah. Sarah, who didn't think that she should be treated like herself, and she was being treated as an equal, and that caused great friction between them. So we have Abraham using the law of the time and going beyond it. With Sodom and Gomorrah, oh, good grief. Hey, I've got an article coming out in Christianity. Read that. I'll go in. Quick question, yeah. How do you look at all this in the context of the verse, love your enemy? And of course, the love your neighbour as yourself comes from the Old Testament, not from the New Testament. It's repeated in the New Testament. Love your enemy is what Jesus then said, you know, this is how really to test your love. Yes, love your enemy. If your enemy is attacking you, you've got to do something. And I was pointing out that in the Old Testament, Israel is being more lenient than other nations around, and being as lenient as they could, and perhaps even being lenient in a dangerous way, because if they're endangering themselves by letting some of these people live. But yeah, how do you love an enemy who's hitting you with an axe? I don't know. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, it seems that the Old Testament is just a thorn in the side, and it's not really relevant these days. So my only concern is that it's used as the basis for a lot of persecution of different groups, or it's used to justify attitudes towards people. And why doesn't, I'm just wondering why Christians haven't sort of spoken out and said, or there's not.
Yeah. The question is, the Old Testament seems to be used by groups who want to persecute other groups. It's a thorn in the side of Christians, and why don't we speak out? And I thought you were going to go on to say, why don't we throw it away?
Yeah, we'll throw it away, yeah, exactly. I mean, or at least
the Old Testament is part of God's word, and it's very precious. We still use the Old Testament laws now. The Old Testament makes a distinction between murder which is premeditated, and murder which is accidental, and murder which is deliberate. It makes the basis of the laws that we have now. It tells us what God is like. It tells us about God's love despite everything. Even when people are pushing against him, even when people are rejecting him, God is still loving them. But the Old Testament is written for a generation which is now 4,000 years old, so it's difficult for us to get into the skin of it. But when we do, we see a God who is a fantastic lover of people and working with what he had in that time. I don't want to throw away the Old Testament. The Old Testament teaches me too much about God. The Old Testament is the foundation of the New Testament, absolutely. And New Testament is forever quoting the Old Testament. And the New Testament authors tell us that we want both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Let's look at the Old Testament law, because a lot of people say, well, the law that was given to the Jews in the Old Testament, it's so different from anything we want nowadays. It would be lovely just to scrap it completely. The Old Testament world is different from anything we know, even anywhere in the undeveloped world. There are different problems, different limitations, and different solutions. Think about the laws which you would give in a world which was like this, where supporting the poor and the weak is an expense that no one wants to pay for. No one wants to pay for it now, but we manage to coerce the population to pay something, a tax, and manage to support the poor and weak. But how do you do that in the Old Testament where you don't have a computerized tax system or a paper-based system where everyone is named and numbered with their wages? A world where industry and luxury doesn't depend on machines and on electricity, but on slaves. If you don't want to do any work, someone else has to do that work for you. A world where human life was cheap, where possessions like cows were your true riches. A world where the highest form of worship was sacrificing children or lots and lots of animals. In a world that's like that, how do you change that world to be something that you want it to be? What would you do? What would you bring into that sort of society to change it into the ideal that you want? Now, first of all, let's get sacrifices out of the way. We look at the Old Testament, we think, oh, there's all those sacrifices, all those animals being killed for nothing. We want to get rid of sacrifices. So did Moses. And Moses more or less succeeded. In Egypt, there were thousands of sacrifices a day, and in Israel, there were just a handful. When you are brought up with a religion and you find this is the way to worship, you want to continue with it. And you want to continue having the sacrifice because that's the way in which you worship God. But in Israel, you had just one central worship center. You didn't have temples all over the place. You had only one central worship center. And there, how many sacrifices did you have? You have a lamb in the morning, you have a lamb in the evening, and on the Sabbath you might have another one. You have a few other sacrifices. You have a very minimal number of sacrifices, as few as you can deal with. Now, a few extra offerings were brought for festivals, but the great majority of offerings which were made in the temple area were people bringing their food as a sacrifice. They bring along a lamb, the throat is slit, the inedibles are thrown onto the altar, and you go home and you eat the lamb. It's a peace offering or thanksgiving offering. That's a sacrifice. The vast majority of sacrifices were personal offerings, voluntary, brought by people and then eaten by people. A small part went in payment to the priest, and he would eat that. That was part of his wages. In other words, Moses replaced most of the sacrifices with Christmas dinner. Moses couldn't change people's perception of what worship was. They thought it should consist of killing things. Moses minimized this as much as possible. It's like our sentimental attachment to candles. How many of you have candles in your church? Oh, only a few people. Oh, only a few people are admitting to it. Oh, we can't have candles in ours because the health and safety rules say that they're dangerous. Oh, there we are. If we could, we would, I expect. But what's religious about an old-fashioned form of lighting? What's special about this? We make up all sorts of symbolism. Oh, the flame is like the Spirit of God moving where it wills. Well, it doesn't actually move where it wills. If it goes too far from the wick, it goes out. There's nothing spiritual about a candle. It's traditional. It's a traditional way in which we worship. And we have the same attachment to candles as people had to sacrifices. And with 20,000 churches in the country, in the old days, when they made candles from tallow, they actually sacrificed more animals than were sacrificed in the whole of Israel. Tallow comes from animal fat. So our churches actually had more animals being killed for worship than Israel did. Fortunately now they make the candles from beeswax and it's nice and white and it doesn't burn. It's much nicer now. Sacrifices were not got rid of in the Old Testament, but they tried. They tried as much as possible. And the only way in the end to get rid of sacrifice completely was to destroy the temple. And that was a great end. Because in the end, there was only one sacrifice that was needed. That was Jesus. Slavery. Slavery was something they learned in Egypt. They learned it by personal experience. They became slaves. Sometimes an abused person becomes an abuser. Is that why Israel had slaves? Did they learn about slavery and wanted to pass on what their own suffering? No. Everyone, every nation had slavery. Israel was just copying what there was in every other nation. But in Israel, things were very, very different from other nations. The slaves in surrounding nations were property. They had no personal rights. They were bought and sold. In Israel, they had very strict laws about slavery. They humanized the institution. They made it into an institution where each individual slave had rights. The slave had a full set of human rights. Their owners had to feed them, and they had to eat with the family. The law said they even had to share the Passover meal. That's the best meal of the year. That's the Christmas feast. Only it's better than Christmas because they didn't just have a turkey, they didn't just have a leg of lamb, they had a whole lamb which they had to eat by sunrise. Then you feel full. Oops, sorry about the microphone. The best piece of the meal, and it says the slaves even have to eat with the household then. The way in which the Old Testament law goes, you prescribe the least likely, and then that applies to the rest. So most likely they ate with the family all the rest of the time as well. The slaves had protection in Israelite law. Protection from injury, protection from harsh punishments. If their master hit them and maimed them, they were released. And that applied even if their maiming was as little as losing a tooth. Whoop, that tooth came out. Sorry, boss, you're not my boss anymore. And they're free. That's a very expensive tooth. Making someone, and of course, if the slave died, they're liable for murder. In all the other societies, if you kill your slave, that's just your property, you've lost some property. But in Israel, if you kill your slave, you're liable for murder. They were humans, not property. And most slaves in Israel were voluntary, temporary, on a 60-year contract. How do you get slaves? It was illegal to kidnap people to be a slave in Jewish law. So the only way in which you got slaves, involuntary slaves, was during warfare. During warfare, if the people are fighting you and they surrender, you don't kill them if they're outside the nation, you make them into slaves, and you make sure that you keep an eye on them as slaves. So you got some slaves from warfare, but that didn't happen very often. Mostly, the slaves in Israel were voluntary slaves. If you've got a daughter and she's going to get married, it's going to cost you thousands of whatever shekels, and you don't have the money, you mortgage your labour to someone for 6 years. And they give you the money up front, so your daughter can get married, and you are contracted to work for that person. It's called slavery, but you have volunteered yourself. You've mortgaged your labour for 6 years. And at the end of the 6 years, your contract is over. You couldn't go to a bank to get money. There weren't any banks. You can't go to a rich individual for money because they don't have lots of coins around to just give you, because you don't have any security. So you give your labour as security for that huge loan. The difference between a slave and an ordinary worker is where they sleep. A slave sleeps in the master's household, so he's always there, 24-hour duty, except, of course, on Sabbaths. What happens on a Sabbath? The slave gets a day off. Who's ever heard of a slave with a day off? In Israel, it was mandated in the law. Even slaves had to rest on a Sabbath. This was all so different from what was happening outside Israel. Outside Israel, slave was property. You could feed him or you could starve him. Who cares? It's your property. You could work him, you could beat him as you wished. Who cares? You just got as much work as you could out of him. He had no more rights than an animal, than a cow. And if they ran away and went to Israel, Israel made it illegal to return a slave, because they knew what it was like outside Israel. And they gave them asylum if a slave came running to Israel. Modern asylum seekers, they were not let back to the persecution that slave would face back home. Of course, later slavery became something very, very terrible, and in modern society, slavery is so abhorrent, we are quite correctly getting rid of it. And they were getting rid of it as much as they could in Israel by institutionalizing it as a human resource, not as property. Modern Jews, or Jews, sorry, not modern, modern for me means first century. That's why I'm an ancient historian, not just because my hair is going grey. Modern Jews in the first century, they said if you take a slave, oh, you're taking such a financial burden. You've got to feed him even when your family is starving, because you're contracted to feed him, and you've got to give him somewhere to live, and, well, you know, it's a big deal having a slave, because they took the law seriously, and they applied it seriously. What about stoning? So many cruel forms of death in the Old Testament. Garrotting and stoning and maiming. We're much more used to imprisonment and fines. Before we look at that, let's look at Israel's neighbours. Look at her neighbours. There the punishments are really cruel. First of all, there's not only a death penalty for adultery, as in Israel, but if you kiss someone's wife, the penalty is to cut your lips off. Never do that again. If you steal something, you die. In later ancient Near Eastern laws and later Hittite laws, that became a little bit relaxed, but still, in the later Hittite laws, you have to replace a stolen ox with 9 oxen. That's like if you steal a Mercedes, you have to pay the penalty of supplying 9 Mercedes, which you can't do, of course. So it was becoming punishment by fine, which could never be paid. If they aren't sure that you're guilty, what do? They throw you into the river. We're not quite sure what this river is, because not many people seem to have survived it. And some scholars are suggesting it was the bitumen river, the river of sort of oily tar stuff, which they were using in the ancient Near East. And they threw you into that, and if you survived that, okay, then you were innocent. Otherwise, well, you were guilty and you're punished. If you steal something from someone's house, you dig through the mud wall of their house and you steal the stuff and then you escape. When they catch you, they kill you and they stuff your body, your corpse, into the hole. Not quite sure who that is punishing. But they took crime seriously. We say we want to be serious with crime. You ain't seen nothing. And I hope they don't read the ancient Near Eastern laws to find out what to do. In Israel, if someone's burgling you, you're not allowed to kill them. You're allowed to defend your property, you're allowed to hit the burglar, and if accidentally you kill them, okay, but if it's light and you can see that you would have killed them and you do it, you are liable. Very similar to modern British law. Things are fairer, better, more humane in Israel than in any surrounding country. In Israel, goods were far less important than people. People were important. People were the most valuable things. But in the surrounding countries, if you steal something, you're dead. They don't sound moral to us, even Israelite laws, which are more lenient than the laws around them, because we live in a different place. We live in a place which has secure prisons, a place where you can lock people up, impregnable stone walls, which are almost impossible to make in that society. Oh, and in Israel, everyone was subject to the same law. In the ancient Near Eastern laws we find around from the nations around, the rich people had one set of laws, the poor people had another set of laws, and the king was just immune. But in Israel, everyone was the same. Everyone was subject to the same law. And most punishments, this came as a surprise to me, most punishments could be commuted by a fine in Israel. Now we know the laws, an eye for an eye. Did you hear on the news today? A man who has scarred and blinded a girl who persistently refused to marry him and threw acid in her face. He is now going to have acid dropped into his eyes to be made blind in the same way that she's blind now. That's Islamic law now. We're used to reading that sort of thing, eye for an eye, and being horrified by it. But actually, this is something that Copan pointed out, and I checked his sources and the other scholars that he's reliant on. They're pointing out that when you read it in the context, it looks like this is a series of fines, because you also have references to accepting a fine for a life sentence. But, in Numbers 35, do not accept a fine for the life of a murderer. In other words, you can accept a fine for other life sentences and for other punishments. And the whole point of an eye for an eye is that it's the right punishment. It's not exaggerated punishment. It's only that value. It's the value of an eye, not the value of a life that's being fined there. And it looks like there may have been fines for this retributive justice. The point's still contested, but that's the opinion of the best scholars at the moment. And women in Old Testament society, they were looked after. If they were divorced or widowed, they kept the dowry which they brought to the wedding, and they kept the money which the husband gave her when they got married, and they had enough to live on, and especially if they had family to go to. If they didn't have family to go back to, then it was difficult for them. And of course, if they didn't have any children to look after them later in life, you have that very strange law in the Old Testament. You have to go and live with your brother-in-law. That's the ugly one you chose not to marry. You have to go and live with him until you have a male child. Doesn't sound very nice, until you realise in Hittite law, which this was based on, in Hittite law it was compulsory. You had to go and live with a male person from your family. It could be a grandfather, it could be a grandchild, it could be from any generation at all. It was compulsory until you had that child. In Israel, they said, no, it has to be someone from your same generation, someone who's roughly the same age as you, and you can refuse if you wish. It's not compulsory, it's an offer. It's only compulsory on the man that you have to go and get a child from. That's what's compulsory, and that's what Onan did wrong. He wouldn't accept that. So it's compulsory on the men, not on the women. Sex crimes were punished equally for men and women. When a man rapes a woman and found guilty, he is guilty. When they commit adultery, they are guilty. When a man rapes a woman, it seems a very strange law because it says he has to marry her and is not allowed to divorce her. But what that means is she gets all the benefits from that marriage and she has to give nothing in return. In normal divorce law, if either partner doesn't reciprocate food, clothing and love, then they can be divorced. But this man cannot divorce a woman. So she doesn't have to do a thing. She can live like a princess in that house, doesn't have to cook, doesn't have to do any clothing, doesn't have to lie in his bed, and he can't divorce her. He has to look after her for the rest of his life. I think I could cope with that. It turns out that the Old Testament law is not full of cruel and unnatural punishments. Murder is punished by death, and other death penalties were probably carried out, but a lot of things could be commuted to fines. Property crime was only paid by fines on top of replacing the property, and that law is more lenient than many laws today, including in this country. And it stood out as very special in the ancient Near East. The whole philosophy of the law was different. Men and women had more or less the same rights, as much as possible. Slaves and free had protection under the law, protection from injury, protection from death. Rich and poor were equally liable, faced the same law, same penalties. And those are the philosophies behind modern law, at least behind the best modern laws. The only difference is how they were able to apply it in the culture, in the limitations of the time. Thank you. Now we have to make the lady with the microphone run around. Oh, you got it. Helen. This is taking over the baton, is it?
Would it not also be helpful to point out, I mean, one of the things that Jesus says in Matthew 19 when he's dealing with divorce and remarriage is that Moses gave you this law because you were so hard of heart. And it seems to me that God's intentionality within giving so much of the law to the Israelites is precisely because he was dealing with people with whom he could do very little apart from the things that he gave them. So it's not merely a matter of, okay, God actually likes all this. He's giving them something that he is working with in a very, very corrupt people, corrupted by the surrounding environment, apart from anything else, apart from their own sinfulness. And then when Jesus comes along, the fullness of the law is given. The law is fulfilled, not abolished, but fulfilled.
I hate to break it to you, but we've still got hard hearts, and divorce still happens.
So we have grace now.
We have grace now, which doesn't work on people who don't let grace work. So we still have divorce, unfortunately. But yes, you're absolutely right. That the law was given to people with hard hearts, and it has to work with the reality of what you have and try and change them. It doesn't start off with perfection.
But what about laws such as if you have disobedient children, take them outside the city and stone them until they're dead?
Yeah, what do you do with a persistent drunkard? What do you do with the person who is forever getting drunk at night and going and wreaking havoc in the community? Do you take them to one side and say, hey, you shouldn't be doing that, guy? Do you lock them up? You can't lock them up. What do you do? And the Old Testament law is very, very strict. It said you have to stone the persistent drunkards. Of course, that was bad news for Jesus when he was charged with being a glutton and a drunkard, the same terminology that's used in the Old Testament. But by New Testament times, they weren't stoning for that anymore because they had prisons to lock people up in. In Mongolia, in the very rural societies, they have the same sort of problem with drunkenness, and there they actually tie a drunk to a pole in the village. And but that doesn't work very well, because as soon as he sobers up, he can untie himself and get away. In the end, if a person is persistently drunk and persistently being a danger to the community, what do you do? Give them a 24-hour guard? They had the death penalty. Yeah. But now we can put them under guard for 24 hours. They were also disobedient, yes. They get very disobedient when they're drunk. Yeah.
Two things quickly. You were going to address the issue of stoning, but I don't think you got a chance to go back to it because you referred to other cultural examples. Maybe you might want to address the issue of stoning. But the other question I was going to ask, probably to throw the question back at you, that to a large extent you've contextualized everything. But I throw the question back to you. Why is God, at least in the context of the Old Testament, not a moral monster? If you want to give a quick submission to that, that would be cool.
I would not agree that God is a moral monster in the Old Testament. I would say that God is bringing morality to an Old Testament society and correcting that society in a wonderful way. People stoning. We think of stoning as being a barbaric way of killing people, and it is. It's horrible. And certainly when it's carried out in the modern Islamic world, where you bury someone up to their waist so they can't move, and then you throw stones at them, it is barbaric, and especially when they're throwing those small stones which just injure them for ages. The whole point of stoning was it was a community way in which to kill someone. It wasn't someone going to do the execution. It's, in a modern world, we would use a firing squad, where you have a whole group of people representing the whole of society, all shooting at once. A firing squad only needs one person shooting, but the whole point of using a squad of people is that no one person is the executioner. With stoning, it's the ancient version of that. The whole community is supposed to be involved in this stoning. But actually, when we know how it worked in New Testament times, so we have some of the records of what they actually did, and they would take people to a gully or a big cliff, push them off so that they would be killed by being pushed off, and then drop stones on them. If they weren't killed, they would drop some big stones on them so that they're killed, and then everyone stones them. Of course, with a sort of mob violence, like you have with the adulteress who was brought to Jesus, you can't organise things like that, but that was the way it's supposed to happen. They were not supposed to suffer. They were supposed to be killed almost immediately, and then the community joins in to show the whole community is agreeing in this death penalty. And if they had guns, they would have used them instead.
Still on stoning then, I think it's Numbers 26.
Where are you?
A man goes out to pick up sticks on the Sabbath day, and God says, you've got to stone him.
Yeah.
And I can't see any, I can't really come to terms with that
Disproportionate
whatsoever.
justice, you think? Yes, there you have Sabbath law being applied in a very draconian way with death penalty. I guess the best thing we can say with that is no one did it again. You know, it sent out a message. But I agree that on that individual level, it was not justice. And I'm horrified when modern judges do exactly the same thing. A crime comes to them, they say, we've had too many of these, we've got to send out a message, and they disproportionately punish that person so that it's picked up by the newspapers, everyone's talking about it, and everyone knows how serious that crime is. I can't square that in my mind. I wouldn't like to be that judge doing that. But those judges today recognise that sometimes disproportionate justice is needed so that a message goes out. And I guess I would see it like that, but it rankles with me.
Thanks for the opportunity to ask this question. It may be a bit out of the specific remit, but since this is an opportunity to understand why some Old Testament laws happened, the time it happened, another aspect I'm sure some of us may be interested in is the applicability to the Christian faith today. And that's how I would like to quickly stretch, since we just mentioned about the Sabbath now, the specific bit I would like you to comment on is the area of tithing, where, again, the Jews were made to offer some money.
Should we now be tithing in the same way as in the Old Testament law?
That's place, yeah. That's my concern.
Yeah, in the Old Testament law, you paid 3 tithes. You paid the first tenth to the temple, you paid the second tenth to poor people, and you had a third tenth which you spent on yourself and the festivals. I don't know any church who teaches that you give 30% of your income for religious reasons. I would love there to be a church which follows the Old Testament law and give that every person to give 10% to the poor, to give 10% to religious and educational institutions, remember, not just religious, and to spend 1/10 on holidays. I love that holiday tax. Yep. But I know no church that does that. And the New Testament certainly doesn't encourage us to apply the Old Testament law of tithing in that exact way. The New Testament encourages us to give generously without quibbling, to give to those who are in need, and not to, we don't have to follow that same Old Testament law.
I've got a slightly controversial question for you. It seems to me that if God is a person, there are some things that matter powerfully and deeply to him. And if that is the case, when we read things that appear to be disproportionate, it would seem to me that what God is saying is, hello, neon, flashing light, this really, really, really matters to me. It might seem disproportionate to you, but instead of focusing on what seems like a barbaric punishment, look at how much I mean this. If the human life, the individual human life, is so important, and if I did make it, then when I say these things that appear disproportionate, perhaps I, as God, I'm not suggesting that I'm God, you understand? Yeah, perhaps I am God, I'm saying, my giddy aunt, this matters, and it matters enough to exaggerate. I don't know if that's a biblical. I don't know. I'm guessing.
Yeah,
I'm just checking it out.
That may be helpful for some things, but I would still have problems with
yes.
the penalty for collecting sticks.
Yes.
But I think it's a better answer to say, well, it matters out getting a message out. But I agree with you that we see a very clear message in the Old Testament when you contrast it with the ancient Near Eastern laws, where in the ancient Near Eastern laws, if you stole property, there was death penalty.
Yeah.
In Judaism, in the Old Testament laws, if you stole property, there was never a death penalty, because people are more important than things.
Yes. Yeah. So, but then there's also the question about what's more important, the collective or the individual. But that's another whole subject. Anyway, thank you.
You said that God is correcting morality in a wonderful way, but sometimes it seems like God is compromising by condoning violence to achieve morality.
Condoning violence to achieve morality. Yeah, God is not one who uses violence without necessity, and I don't know how else to do it. Where do you put a murderer to confine him rather than killing him? Where do you put someone who's a danger to society? It's doing what's necessary, not what he wants to do. We're getting 2 minutes to 1. Someone who hasn't...
Question from the back again.
Okay.
Hi.
Yeah.
There are 2 good examples that have been raised so far. There's the issue of Lot and his daughters, and then there's killing somebody for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. How do you go about figuring out, when these things are reported in the Old Testament, whether that's something which is actually condoned by God, or whether it's just reports what people happen to be doing? So, for example, with Lot, God would probably be actually looking at him saying, I love you, but you're a prat. You're not meant to be doing that, So that kind of thing. How do you work out if it's condoned?
The stories that are reported in the Old Testament, it's very rare do you have a comment as to the morality of it. We're not even told when David does things with Bathsheba that is wrong, until Nathan comes along and condemns him. You sometimes have a prophet comes along. And most of the stories are just told as stories, and we have to go by the laws in the Old Testament to understand what God thinks is right and wrong. So the Old Testament is not a simple book to read in this is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. It demands our intelligence, it demands our thinking, it demands our prayer. Yeah. One last question. Come on, run. Sorry.
Yeah, just quickly, it seems that women got quite a raw deal with being concubines and that sort of thing. You wonder why God didn't have a law that included...
Half the women in this country are concubines. Half the women living with men are concubines. A concubine is a woman who is living with a man, who's having children with that man, who has not said vows in public with that man. And so the women who are living with partners have the same legal rights and the same legal limitations as concubines in the ancient Near East. When they separate, they don't have the rights of property, they don't have the rights of their children enshrined in law, which a wife has. And concubines were not a good institution. It was not instituted in Israelite law. It was something which was allowed, but only as something which they'd inherited from other places. And God tried to stamp it out, and I wish we would stamp it out now.
I suppose the power relations were a bit different in those days.
The power relations were different. Women were absolutely nothing outside Israel. Women had almost equal rights within Israel. Yeah. Right, thank you very much. And